So welcome everybody to our seminar webinar on multi-lane racing today. You've got myself, Zoe, you've got Morgan, and you've got Autumn.
Hello,
so
everybody.
we will be taking you through this session today. So we have quite a lot to cover, and we don't have a huge amount of time to cover it in. So what we are going to do is we are going to try and make this session as applicable for as many different people in as many different standards. What's the word I'm looking for? This is a bad start if I don't know my words. Through from novice to experience. So if you have any questions, thank you. If you have any questions as you go along, if you want to ask something, for example, that might be a bit more in depth, then stick it in the chat and one of us will try and answer it as we go along. Or if you want to clarify anything, if you think we've gone too fast, then same, just ask us and we'll try and answer. Some of the stuff we're going to cover is going to be sort of the more basic stuff. So if you are more experienced, then please do stick with us. The other thing we're going to do is at the very end of the session, we are going to go through in detail getting attached to the stake boat. So that's going to be particularly useful if that is something that you want more in-depth detail about, but we're not going to do that at the very beginning or in the middle of the seminar, just for those who are comfortable with it. But if that's something that you're concerned about, please do stay to the end and we'll try and make sure that that is in the final recording as well. So thank you for being here. We are three of the WOX mentors. We are trying to get information out to coxes, share our knowledge, help you guys find your authentic voice, help you whether you're a cox, a coach or a rower, to get the best out of yourself or the coxes in your team. We're trying to offer as much of this for free as we possibly can. We don't want there to be a financial barrier to our information. But if you would care to support us in that, you can buy us a coffee. That is the
QR code.
Thank you. I was trying to do two things at once. That did not work for me.
Well.
So that's the QR code. You can point your phone at that, or I will stick in a little while. I'll stick the link in the chat as well. But let us get going with multi-lane racing. Morgan is going to be operating the slides, so we'll see if she can work out as I go when I want my slides to be changed. So summer racing, those of you in the UK will have noticed that there's sun all of a sudden. This is what we're going to go through. We're going to go through just general prep, the warm-up, getting attached, and like I said, we'll do a more in-depth part of getting attached at the end. We're going to talk about racing and creating a race plan, as well as steering on buoyed courses. A little bit about cool down, then we'll have a section for Q&A, and like I said, we'll then go back at the end to talk about getting attached in depth. So those of you who have heard me talk before will know that I like to prep everything, and I like to make sure that I have as much done in advance so that I know that on the day I can focus on what needs to be done. So here are a few things that I would get done before you even get to race day. So first of all, you want a packing list. This is an example of what I would have. So I would have all my boat bits. And now this is important. I once went with an international crew to race at a regatta in Amsterdam, and we got there and we didn't have our backstays. So it happens. Make sure that, even if you've got a lovely coach or a lovely boatman or someone who does it all, I would go through that trailer if I could and make sure that I have all my blades, all my backstays, both bits of my 8, all that kind of thing, the seats, like all your bits that you need, because it happens. Make sure you've got some spares for the boat. Again, you might have someone who helps you with that, or you might need to get that on your own, and that would be things like nuts and bolts. I would have maybe some the height washers, that kind of thing, depends on the boat. And then your own personal equipment, so your life jacket, your cox box or your speed coach, which need to make sure that they are charged and ready to go, even possibly with a spare. It might be that you have one spare between a few of you, but make sure you've got a backup. Kit for all weathers. So I have been at regattas where I raced a final of Henry Royal. We boated, and I boated in an all-in-one of those paper thin splash tops, And by the time I got to the start, there was a storm and I got completely soaked and freezing. So make sure you've got stuff for all weathers, you've got spares, you're ready to go, basically. Food and drink for yourself, make sure you have enough to eat and drink. No matter what, no matter how much you weigh going into it, you need to be well fed and well hydrated at the start of your race, or you're not going to perform. And then you make sure you've got your pocket money for your merch shopping, especially if you're coming to Nat schools, for example, where there will be merch from WOX ready to buy. The other things you need to think about the day before are just some of your planning, looking around the regatta course. So you'll hopefully have looked at the course itself, but the thing I like to look at as well is the off-water layout. So having an idea when you turn up, roughly where your trailer's going to be, your tent if there is one, and then knowing where the toilets are, where the weigh-in is, where you have to go collect your numbers from. On a site you've not been to before, that can be really, really useful because it can just save you a lot of hassle on the day. Your timings, I'm going to give you an example of your timing sheet on the next page, but that needs to be something that's sorted in advance. Like I said, having your equipment charged and ready to go. And then the other thing that a lot of us talked about that we found we were often left to deal with was our dead weight. So if you are someone who you know is going to need dead weight, a lot of regattas, most regattas won't provide that for you. You need to have something with you ready to go. And that could be, depending on how much you need and what your boat's like, that could be some weights that are wrapped up, say in bubble wrap to keep the shell safe. It could be water bottles with sand in, for example. You can buy one of our lovely WOX dry bags, if you like, and fill those with stones or sand. They are quite a good option to have. But whatever it is, it needs to be something that's not going to damage the boat. It needs to be not attached to you. That's really important. And it needs to be something ideally that is going to be wedged in the boat without moving and disrupting the rowing as it goes along. So I used to use, for example, a piece of lead piping. I don't know where it came from. I found it at the boathouse. That was exactly the right length, basically, to fit in between in my foot plate and my seat. So it wouldn't go anywhere once it was in, and it was padded, perfect. So have that ready to go before the day. So I will give you an example of race timings. This is obviously going to differ for your crew, but this is the extent to which I like to know when things are going to happen. Those of you in particular who cox 8s will know that it's like herding cats, you know, making sure everyone is in the same place at the same time. So I want to know that everyone is going to arrive, turn up at the right time and be there to rig, and not just, you know, say, oh, I forgot, sorry, that we had to put the boat together. I'm going to want to know either when I need to pick up the race number or, you know, make sure if someone's doing it for me, when that's going to happen. Weigh in, which is usually an hour to 2 hours before your race. I like to get it out of the way as quickly as possible, just so it's out of the way and done. And I don't have to worry about it. You want your time for your crew briefing. And then you want a time when you know you're going to start your off-water warm-up. If you do one, you're stretching, get your blades down, your last check of the boat. And then one really important one is last toilet stop. I think this is absolutely vital. And you might need to leave more time if the toilets are far away. And I know this might sound really mundane stuff, but I had a crew member whose name I shall not mention, but she used to go for a wee so many times before the race that we had to build in extra time just for that. I once saw her walk out of the toilet having gone for her last wee and then turn around and go straight back in again for another wee. So that was the extent of extra time we would have to build in for her. So then you want to know when you're going to boat, and when you've got down to the race course, you're going to have checked what the boating situation is like. You're going to go down there, you're going to see, right, am I going to be able to go straight out on the water? Or am I going to have to queue for ages? Will I need to take trestles down, and will I need to leave more time for that? This is all stuff you want to be looking at when you get down there. And then you're going to have your time ready to be at the start, your race, off the water, and then in advance, you want to set a time for the debrief. So everybody knows where they need to be and when for the debrief. They've not wandered off to go have a walk, go see their mum. You know, they all know where and when they need to be. Obviously, make sure you've got a a watch that works and is set to regatta time. But this is the example of how in-depth you want to be. And this is something you sit down with your coach, with your crew, and plan in advance. So on the day, like I said, get yourself down there, get yourself orientated, know where you need to be for the boating, know what it looks like, how long it's going to take you. Have a look at the weather conditions. So go down there, see what the wind's doing, see what that means for the course and what that's going to mean, for example, for getting attached, for your race plan. Do your final boat check. So making sure things like heel restraints, bow balls, anything that you can get picked up on by an umpire, an official on your way down that's going to slow you down. And I don't know why I've written something else at the bottom. That must have meant something to me at the time, and it has now gone from my head. So this is the things you need to do on the day before you even get onto the water. And I know that sounds really dull, but these are the things that make your day run so smoothly, because this means that by the time you actually get to your race warm-up, you're going to feel confident and you're going to feel calm, and you're not going to have been stressing about, you know, not knowing anything like that. So I will hand over now to talk about the race warm-up.
So your race warm-up, we want to make sure that it needs to be planned. So you're not going to do anything random on the day. You're going to know exactly what you're going to go through. We need to understand it, and you need to be able to have enough time in which you can execute that race warm-up. So much of what you do as a cox is about planning, it's about sticking to your timings, and it's about executing exactly what you're looking for. And that means that every part of your warm-up needs to have a purpose. So nothing becomes random, and you understand the critical elements of that warm-up that you need to do. So for example, sometimes you might boat and say something goes wrong. I don't know, you checked everything and a wheel on the seat comes off, and so that takes 20 minutes to fix, and now you've only got 20 minutes to get to the start line. You need to know what are the really important critical parts of that warm-up that you need to get done before you race. So that might be that you go straight into rowing whole crew, you're going to do a few bursts and a couple starts, and that's enough in a very kind of last resort scenario to get you prepared and get you ready to race. So understanding your warm-up, what's in it, why it's there, and how to execute that is really important. Another thing you can do is take a look at the warm-up area, or the area in which you have to actually complete the warm-up. So this is taken from Wallingford Regatta. This is at Dorney Lake, and this is the map they provide for the warm-up area. So if we simply look at the map, we know that we've got, it's going to be 2K long total from start to finish, but there are going to be certain areas within that you aren't allowed to warm up in. You can't do bursts in. The top 500, you're going to be simply lining up and under the marshal's instructions. So your warming up needs to happen probably within like a 1,000 meter, 1,250 meter range. And you can see by this that you can only turn at the 1,500, 1,000 or the 500 meter marker. So you need to think about how many loops do I need to do? What's involved in my warm up? What's the race direction? What's the wind like? And then here's a bit of an example of how you might plan your warm up based on the circulation pattern for something like Dorney Lake. So you're going to come through the bridge. There's the little orange bridge at the bottom, and you're probably going to spend the first kilometer. You might do something simple like a legs progression in sixes. If you're in an 8, if you're in a 4, it might be in pairs. So that's like legs only, legs, hips, and arms. That might even be, you build it up from the back end, arms only, arms and bodies, quarter, half, 3/4, full. And then once you've gone through maybe 2 sixes progressions, you're going to go into whole crew rowing, and you're maybe going to get about 600 meters of steady rowing in, and then you know that you're going to turn at the 500 meter mark. So you've maximized the area available, you've used the full length, so it's going to be a big loop, and you might give yourself about 10 minutes to do that, because it's probably going to be a bit stop-starty, you're going to be moving around a little bit, so you've got to provide a little bit of wiggle room. Then you're going to turn, and you can do 3 times 15 strokes at different rates in the racing direction. So that might be below pace, on pace, and above pace. An example of that is going to be below might be 28, on pace might be 32, 34, pace being the speed at which you're going to cruise at. And then above pace is something like 38 and above. It's really short, sharp, and punchy. In this scenario, we're going to utilize that 4,000 meters that's available, and we'll turn at the 1,500 mark. And then very simply, we're going to do a long, steady row, just back up to the 500 meter marker. So again, you've utilized probably a kilometer of rowing, and it might take you a bit of time. It's going to take you maybe between 5 and 8 minutes to row that 1,000 meters, because again, you're navigating around different crews. Then you're going to turn, and this time you're only going to do a short loop. So you're going to do some starts, and that might be a 5-stroke, a 10-stroke, and a 15-stroke start. And the idea here is that it gets you ready, and once again, they're in the racing direction. So we want to practice as much as we can in the condition in which we're going to race. Then simply you're going to turn at the 1,000 meter point, which means you've got about 500 meters to paddle back up until you enter the area in which you're going to marshal, and you're going to be under the marshal's instructions. You're going to leave yourself maybe another 5 to 8 minutes to do this. Once you get into the top area, you're probably going to be getting in number order, so they can get you onto the state boats or in the order in which you're going to go off in the race. You want to listen clearly to their instructions. Once the race that's currently on the start line has gone, they're going to call you through the bridge into the kind of state boat area, and then you're going to be under kind of starter's orders, starter's instructions there as to what lane you're going to. So a bit of an example of what kind of path your boat's going to take when you do this. This might work, it might not. Okay, so we've got a little pirate boat. That's going to be your rowing boat. And it's going to go take full use of the distance up to the 500, some bursts down, paddle back up, going to do some starts, back up into the marshalling area, through the bridge and onto the state boats. If you plan this all out, you know exactly what you're going to do, where you're going to do it, and you maximize the racing direction. Another thing for you guys to think about is how you're going to get attached. So listen carefully to the lane in which you're in. The lanes are going to be decided by the conditions. So say you've done a time trial and you were the fastest qualifier, they're going to want to put you in the best lane. Now, if there's no wind, that kind of goes down a bit of a chevron pattern, a bit of an arrow. So lanes 3 and 4 are usually the favourable lanes for the fastest qualifiers. If there's a crosswind, they're going to change the seeding in which lane you're going to be in. So you need to listen carefully for what that's going to be. You also need to understand the wind direction when you're moving to get into your lane and onto your state boat. So if there isn't much wind, you can row across the lanes and stop when the middle of your boat is in the middle of your lane. But then you're going to do a turn, one side or back, one side or tap, so that you're in the direction of travel in the centre of your lane, and you can quite simply back it down to the state boat. Now, it gets a bit more challenging if there's a crosswind. If you are rowing into the crosswind, then we know what's going to happen is you're going to want to go a little bit further past the middle, because that wind is going to push you back the direction in which you came. So if you go a little bit further past, by the time you've turned, you're going to stay into the middle, and it's going to be easier for you to navigate your boat when you're backing it down. If you're going with the wind as you row across the lanes, you're going to have to stop a bit earlier, because that wind's going to push you further. So you want to stop a bit earlier. By the time you've got yourself turned around, you're probably then going to be in the middle of the lane, and you can back it down to the state boat. So pay attention to the wind. It's also an early opportunity for you to get an understanding of the race conditions, because you're going to know, once you've accommodated for that wind to simply get attached to the state boat, you need to know where the wind is in order to point your bow straight. And you also need to know that what's likely going to happen is a wind going to try and push us out of a lane during the race. What's going to happen there? Is it going to be a headwind? Am I going to need them to square late? Is it going to be a tailwind? Could this be a quick race? So you start to kind of gather information as you're exposed to the racetrack. So a little bit of diagram here. This is simply, typical of Dorney Lake. You're going to come through the bridge. You're going to row across the lanes. You've been the number 1 seed. They're going to put you in lane 4. You look at the state boats. You're going to count 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 is in the middle. Right, that's what I'm aiming for. It's not really a windy day, so I'm going to row until my hull is in the middle. Then I'm going to easy there, turn myself round, and then back it onto the state boats. Nice and simple. So we don't need to overcomplicate it. Just be present. Really think about what's going on around you. getting attached and when you're on those state boats. So hopefully this video plays, but this is a video from the amazing photographer, Ben Rutherford. You can also find him on Instagram, so please check him out. And this is a video of Pablo Scullers, the coxes Antonia Stutter. She has actually recently won the Walgrave with Thames at Henry Royal Regatta. She was also a coxswain for Oxford. She coxed the Cyrus in the women's boat race back in 2016. And this is a situation where there is a crosswind. It's going to come across from bow side to stroke side. And she's using two of her athletes to scratch the boat on. So that means that they've passed the blades forward. Rowers in front of them are taking small, tiny strokes to keep the boat straight in the wind. And this is really useful for two reasons. One, it's going to keep them straight and it's very effective with not a lot of effort. Two, it's not going to pull the boat out of the state boat holder's hands. There's been many a times when people have pulled the boat off of the state boat holder and then they've had to re-back it down. It just takes a long time. So let's see if this plays. So you can see that they're very simply just scratching it on sideways into the wind. And it means that what they can then do is allow the boat to naturally straighten with the wind direction. And by the time they've got attention go, they're going to go off in a straight line. So these are things you can practice at home and in training before you even get there. So I knew there was a way I could get fleet management into here. And this is a prime example of why we practice fleet management every day in training so that we can manage our boat, manage our hull on race day. Once you're attached, keeping the boat straight, point your bow into the wind, you're scratching on. Another option to use is you can use the bow and the two-seat to hold the boat straight. They're simply going to take very small strokes at the very catch. What you can also do is as one of the rowers tap on from the catch, the opposite one can sit at the very finish and back it down. And that just helps to hold it a bit stiller and not pull it away from the state boats, as we mentioned before. Stay calm, remind the crew the first few strokes of the race plan, you know, what they're trying to focus on, and just take the time to breathe. Now, I've got a little bit of a recording from kind of what I say when I've been on the state boats racing, so hopefully this will play.
We're in. Okay. Okay, guys, 2 minutes. You're just going to breathe with me. In and out. In and out. Really calm. In and out. Composure. Complete. Confident.
For the women's leg team, Denmark is
United.
one, stroke by Astrid Steinberg, cox by Sophie Ostergaard. Lane 2, Italy, stroke by Giorgio Palacci and cox by Alessandra Fayet.
Careful and breathe.
In lane 3, Romania, stroke by Simona
1 minute.
cox by Adrian Monteani.
So you can see there's a lot of things still going on the start line. So you're going to have the starter asking certain things from the crews involved. You hear at the beginning, the umpire asked to see the dead weight of one of the coxes in the race. So if you're carrying dead weight, you're going to be asked to show that. You've got to hold that up in the air. So that's something to bear in mind when you're choosing what you use as dead weight and how you present that. You can hear there's going to be different announcements. So in this scenario, they're announcing the teams that are on the state boats. You might have the umpires asking crews to go in different lanes or trying to advise them on how to get straight. You can hear in that I'm telling them timings. Okay, it's 2 minutes until official start time. It's 1 minute until official start time. I'm getting them to breathe, to remain calm, try and hone them in, focus on our boat and only our boat. And then I talk through some of the first parts of our race and talk about some of our kind of values and mantras as a team. So you don't have to say too many things. You can be relaxed and calm. The more calm you are, the easier it is to focus on the task at hand. Okay, we're on to the next part, steering a buoyed course.
Hello. Okay, leave that picture up for now and we'll get through some of the others in a second. So we're going to start with the thing that was probably asked the most when we sent out the form for you guys to fill out, and that was about steering straight on a buoyed course. So I'm going to go through that now. So the main thing that I would say is kind of following on from what Morgan was just talking about, that off the start, you need to know about your crew. Are you a crew that has a person in the bow seat who tends to pull it round? You've got to remember that they've got some pretty good leverage in the bow seat. It might even be your 2-seat that does that. You never know who it might be. But if your bow is typically going to swing one way or the other on every start, and that keeps happening in training, then you need to account for that on the start and make sure that where your bows are pointing does account for that. That obviously is really only relevant in a sweep boat, less relevant in a sculling boat. And I guess the more experience that you get throughout your kind of coxing career, it will be less relevant to do that, because hopefully we like to think that your coach would choose who to put where in the boat to make sure that that wasn't going to happen. So it shouldn't be a huge issue, not something to stress about. But if it's happening in training, you can account for it on the start line. Similar goes for in a crosswind. Morgan's already kind of gone through how you deal with that on the start. But it can actually stay true through the whole course, which is that don't be afraid to think about, pointing your bows into the wind down the course. It's more important that you are in your lane, not on the buoys. It doesn't matter if you're having to steer quite a bit during the race, because if it's a really strong crosswind, everyone is going to be doing that. So it feels unnatural. It's not nice. Yes, it might slow the boat down, but ultimately everyone is going through that. So committing to it and making sure that you've practiced doing that is really crucial. So just thinking about kind of the reference markers that you can use to help keep your boat straight. I would often find that using something in the distance doesn't often work on a course like this, because one, sometimes there just isn't really anything to look at. If you think about sitting on the start line at Dorney, there's not really a lot there. You can't really see any distinguishing features. The building is a rectangle, so there's just nothing to aim for. So we would normally recommend that you go off of one buoy line. Some people like to use both, but as you can see in this picture that I've got here of Henry, you actually have quite an obscured view from the coxing seat. And because the rower takes up so much of your view, it can be really difficult and off-putting to try and figure out if you're in the middle. So you're more likely to be accurate, I think, if you go off of one side. Which side you prefer is very much personal. So have a go at doing both during your training and give that a go. To kind of follow on from that, I would say that you really need to make sure that you're giving yourself a margin of error with that. So if you're steering off of one buoy line, it's really tempting to get, really close to that buoy line, which you don't really want to do, because if anything were to happen, like a gust of wind, someone clips a blade, or even just a quick change in pressure from one side or the other, then you can end up in a pretty sticky situation very quickly. So you just want to avoid that by giving yourself a decent margin of error, which is going to be different depending on the width of the lanes, kind of where you're racing. People like to say that that isn't a thing, but it definitely is. We've all raced on narrow lanes before, or wide ones. So just kind of judge that when you're sat on the start line. Just think to yourself, okay, I'm in the middle now, obviously. How much room do I have on either side? And you can use that as a reference as you go down the course. Also, just another thing that can happen as you're in your steering is if you're in a kind of one-on-one battle during the race, it's really easy to get drawn into the person that you're racing and end up very close to their buoy line. So just be aware of that and make sure you're not getting sucked into the racing, because you're constantly looking over that shoulder. It can be really tempting to accidentally steer that way as well. And you don't want to do that. We don't want to be crossing buoy lines, and we don't want to be clashing where we can. But sometimes that does happen. Sometimes it's not your fault. Sometimes it's the other person's fault. And if it does, remain calm. Make sure that you have a plan for that situation, which we'll go through a little bit when I talk to you about how you structure a race plan and all your what ifs and things. But ultimately, you really need to make sure that you stay calm and you're just ready to make a change for the next stroke. Nothing too drastic, because a really big steering decision can actually just end up with you on the other buoy line, and that's not good either. And once you start doing that, it's really easy to start just bouncing off of one side to the other, which we really definitely want to avoid. So little and often with those steering movements, little adjustments in those tricky moments, if a wind comes or if you just happen to be drawn into the crew next to you. You just don't want to over egg it, basically, because you've got to remember that when you steer, it's not always an immediate response from the boat. In fact, it never is immediate. There is a bit of a delay. So if you think, oh gosh, I've not moved quick enough, and then you keep going, you'll definitely end up on the other side, the other buoy line, and then you're going to have to correct again. And then you've just done a lot of steering, and you will have probably lost quite a lot of boat speed in that process. So little and often is definitely the way. I'd say most of that kind of in my head, I'm picturing talking about an 8. And if we look at the next picture from Morgan, this is a picture of Sasha, one of the other WOX mentors. And as you can see, behind her coming off the stern is that slightly darker patch of water, that line. So in training, something that you can do is actually just occasionally look behind you and see, oh, is the line behind me looking straight? Obviously, if it's a super windy, wavy day, that's going to be a different story. But on a flat lake like this, it's really good to be able to look back and see, is my wash coming off the boat really wiggly or is it straight? And you can try different things and then look back and get that instant feedback. Also, if you have a regular stroke seat, you can talk to them about it and you can get them to give you some feedback on it if that's something that you would like to do. When it comes to coxing a bow loader, a 4+, I had a little chat with Erin, one of the other mentors, who is the Para 4 cox. So she spends a lot of time in a bow loader. And she was saying that she definitely likes to steer off of one buoy line. She tends to prefer the bow side buoy line because often she can see that blade in her peripheral vision. So it kind of is just a little bit more like imagery for her to see how much space she's got off of the buoy line. She said that now it's almost like automatic that she does that and she doesn't really use the blade, but especially when she was learning, just knowing where that oar is really helpful. So that kind of covers most of the things with steering, but there's a couple of extra tips I just want to throw in there, which I definitely have found really useful and probably learned a little bit too late. So hopefully this is really useful. But number one, it is absolutely a myth that you can only steer when the blades are in the water. Okay, like when you're in a situation like crosswinds coming in, or actually just steering down a 2K course, it is not realistic that you can only steer when the blades are in the water, e.g. off the start when you're doing quarter slide strokes. It's just not possible. But actually this does apply throughout the race as well. The most important thing is that you're doing small, smooth adjustments. You're not yanking it on, which causes a big shake in the boat. You're just being gentle with it, but you can do it quite consistently when feels appropriate to keep the boat straight. And I would challenge anyone that tells you that that's wrong to get in a coxing seat and try it for themselves. So also, if it is a narrow lane, which has happened to me before, where I've kind of sat on the start line and I've gone, hang on a minute, that is way narrower than at any other race course I've sat on. Just feed it to the crew and say, guys, the boys are going to be a bit close to your blades this time. Both sides are going to be experiencing it because it's quite a narrow lane, but trust me, I've got this. And then they're not going to be panicked that suddenly, you know, if you normally steer off of the stroke side buoy line and suddenly bow side are like, hang on a minute, I'm on this buoy line the whole time, what is going on? It's not a distraction for them. And also it just shows that you've acknowledged that. So yes, that kind of covers steering. I had a little picture of Erin's bow here as well. The next picture. Yeah, that's just what it looks like, your view from the 4 seat. There you go. Okay, let's move on to race plans. So this is something that I am very fussy about. I always was when I was coxing. And then when I went into coaching, it only really developed as I was kind of helping my coxes and my crews develop their race plans. And I think there is so much to be said for really being quite particular with your race plans. So on the left with the orange outline is an example template for how I would structure a race plan. Now, I'm not saying that this is exactly how you should do it, but you can kind of copy the rough format of this table, and hopefully that should be useful. So the main thing that we're going to start on is breaking it up into reasonable chunks. So how you're going to break up the race is really crucial. So you've got to think about the key moments in your race. Are you going to break it up with distances, or are you going to break it up with time? There's not a right or wrong, but it's something you need to discuss with your crew. Okay, race plans should be collaborative, and trust me that the rowers will be a lot more willing to buy in the moments, and they'll know what's going on if they've been a part of building the race plan. So everything we're about to talk about with the race plans needs to be collaborative. I would suggest sitting down with your crew and having 1, 2, even 3 over the full racing season, sit downs to go through this and make sure you're constantly adapting it and adding to it to make it perfect for you, depending on what your final race goal is. Okay, and you can do that in training with training pieces too. So you need to think about, where are your moves going to be? So again, there's no right or wrong on this. Every coach, every crew might have a different idea of where they're going to do it. The example I've given here is doing the classic 10 strokes in and 10 strokes out of the 1K. Now, that wouldn't necessarily be the only move that you have in the race. This is just an example. But make sure that not only, as you break this up, are you thinking about what you're going to do and what the aim of what you're doing is, but how you're going to do it. So you'll notice that here I've got 4 columns. So obviously we've got the distance or time, the call you're going to make, which is pretty self-explanatory. That's actually what you're going to say. The aim is what you're hoping to achieve with that call, and how is the most important thing for the rowers. Because you need to know, what is your call going to ask them to do in what way? So are you going to ask them to step onto the rhythm and just let them, all 8 of them, do it in their own perceived way? Or are you going to tell them that we're going to step on the rhythm by really driving the hips through, into, in, 1, go? And you need to be really clear on that. And you shouldn't have to use necessarily that whole call when it comes to your final race day. It should be that you've practiced it enough to know that that's how you're going to do it, but you still would like to probably have it written down so you know how it's going to happen. It also allows you to maybe reflect a bit in the moment, like, did we do that in the way that we want? And you can kind of park that for your debrief. So I would say that those 3 columns, hopefully 4 columns, are hopefully quite self-explanatory. And I'll go into a couple of them in more detail as we talk about the different sections of the race in the next slides. But if you look to the right of this page with the grey outlines, these for me are the biggest game changers. And these really reflect having in-depth, useful conversations with your crew. So there's 4 sections here. So we've got crew technical fundamentals. So what are the technical focuses that your crew have been building in your whole season that make your boat go faster? And that can be different for every single crew, and it will work in different ways for different crews. So I've been really basic here and just said catch, drive, face, finish, recovery. Obviously, that is, none of those are actually how you technically do those things. So you need to consider, how do we as a crew take the catch? How do we as a crew structure our drive phase? How do we take the finish? How do we do the recovery? And really kind of bullet point a couple of key points that really represent your crew's technical fundamentals. And that's what I put in that little table. Then what I would have is kind of your there for the whole crew. So then you need some sort of individual or pair tech focuses. And that's really useful to be able to draw upon in the quiet moments of the race, which people have asked about quite a lot, like what do you do in those dull moments? And actually, this is where you can really try and keep the energy up by drawing on pairs or individuals. So knowing how you get the most out of your stern pair or a certain individual is absolutely crucial. So for example, I've said stern pair, separation, 5 and 6 hips, 3 and 4 clean finishes, bow pair catches. Again, maybe be a little bit more specific for your crew, definitely. But when it comes to race day, just having that down will just be a little bit of a reminder for you, so that you are about to get on the water and you know, oh, okay, that's what I'm going to ask for 5 and 6 when things get difficult. Okay, now when I'm saying about things that might get difficult, okay, we're going to go on to the next table, which is what ifs. So we need to think, how are we going to respond to the conditions, e.g. if it's a headwind or tailwind? If there's going to be an incident like a crab, how are we going to handle that? How are we going to stay calm when we're down? And this is all stuff which I can't say to you, this is how you do that. It is so personal to your crews. And this is conversations that you need to have. It is not a one size fits all approach. I can tell you what I did with every single crew that I've ever coxed, but it'd be different for everyone, and we don't have all night. So that's why I'm not just saying this is how to do it. I guess my main message across this whole section, the race plans, is that there is no one way to do this. It is completely collaborative and individual to your crew. Have confidence in that those conversations are what are going to prepare you for your race. As Zoe was talking about, preparation is so crucial, and having a really detailed race plan like this that you can kind of revise and go over in the weeks leading into your race is how you make sure that you're prepared for those difficult moments. It's not in the moment that you do it. It's in the weeks leading up to it that you make those real differences. Hopefully that makes sense. Just going to check my notes and make sure I haven't missed out any key points. Oh yeah, okay, so there's just one little addition that I had here, which was to always know the rules of racing. So one little column that I would have that the rowers necessarily didn't always need to know every single one about, but just making sure that whilst I was thinking about all of this, I also knew what the rules of racing are. So what happens when a red flag is raised? What happens if there's an incident in the first 100 meters? And sometimes these are different for different events. So it's always worth reading. Normally it'll just be standard British rowing racing rules, but don't always assume so. E.g. Henley is completely different to that. So just make sure that you've really read up on that. And that can be a real difference to how you kind of manage yourself in tricky race situations and unique race situations. Okay, so let's move on to breaking down the more individual sections of the race. Now, when we're working off of the start, one of the key things that I'm always looking for in coxes is that they keep it simple, because ultimately you've practiced the start so many times, you don't really need to tell them exactly what they're going to do every stroke. All you need to know are what are your crew goals, and that's in terms of splits or technical points, definitely not race position at that point. And are you achieving them in that moment? Basically, you just kind of need to think, are we on split? And you can tell them that with a simple good, we're on the pace here, this is good, that's a strong start. Just something that is true and useful as feedback for what they're doing. You don't necessarily need to talk them through every single step of the way, because they've done it so many times, they don't need you to do that. Another thing is how you time those calls can be really tricky. And I don't want to butcher Zoe's really good explanation that she articulated so well in their recording analysis webinar. So what I've decided I'm going to do is find the exact time stamp that they talked about that, and I'll put it in the email when we send out this recording to all of you guys, and we'll also put it in the YouTube description of this recording of this webinar, so that you can go back and check that out and go in that a bit more detail. But I want to keep rolling with the different sections of the race for now. So the last thing about the start, I would say, is staying internal, because realistically, you are not going to change what the crew does in those first 40 seconds. It's what you're capable of. They're going to go as hard as they can off the start. You're not going to change anything in that first 40 seconds. Execute, provide feedback, job done. Okay. It's after that that you can start to kind of think about things a little bit more in detail. So we'll move on to that now, which is the main section of the race. Okay. So some key fundamentals for this are that we've already talked about the race plan and how many different ways there are to kind of structure and break up the main parts of the race. But one of the key things is to stick to that. Okay, trust your plan and make sure that you don't try and just reinvent the wheel on the day. Okay, you can only control what you're doing. You can't control what everyone else on the field is doing. And they might throw a surprise at you, but ultimately your plan should include how you're going to deal with that. And that's where those extra columns come in really handy, because you're not just kind of plucking it out of thin air. It's coming from somewhere else in your plan. So trust that plan. You sat down and you built it for a reason. And trust your instincts too. You've built that plan and you know it so well that actually your instinct will probably be correct. And if you think someone is moving on you and you need to respond, trust that instinct and do that. That being said, we're going to move on to that in a second, but we're going to talk about kind of how you deal with those one-on-one scenarios. But there are exceptions to that, okay? Trusting your instincts, just learning your instincts as well. It's always a learning thing. We don't always get it right, and being able to reflect is really crucial. Another thing that I like to think about is being aware of your surroundings. So, for example, you think, oh, I'm on a straight 6-lane course, so there's not going to be any obstacles. Like, that's not always the case. I was racing at WOX in 2021, and there were just a bunch of birds in my lane, and my stroke seat caught one of them and like nearly lost her blade. And we had to come back from that, and it was in the final 200 meters, and it was really chaotic. Well, it could have been, but staying calm was really crucial in that moment. And because I'd considered different things that could be happening and I had a good look at, I was able to prepare them that there were birds in the lane and that they were going to need to be aware that it's very likely someone's going to clash. And because of her awareness of that, she didn't lose her blade, whereas she could have done if I hadn't warned them. So just make sure you're constantly kind of having a look around and you are still making sure of it, that it is clear. Also, there's a lot of potential novices out on the lake that day. You don't know if someone else is going to be where they shouldn't be in the warm-up and all of that kind of thing. It's fine on Dorney, but when you're racing at Nottingham, you know, not everyone, that people are kind of warming up on the same course that you're racing on. So if they've messed up, you need to be aware that they could be there. It's unlikely, but make sure you're keeping a good lookout, basically. Okay, last one is dealing with intense side-by-side situations. Now, this was the probably second most asked question, is kind of how we deal with this and get the correct balance. And I would say that this is where the side tables are so crucial in that race plan. You want to refrain from constant pressure pushes. because you're more likely to get more out of your crew from the technical focuses. So, for example, a call could be, we are going to take a seat on whatever crew by swinging the hips together, or whatever it is that your crew have decided. That's just an example. But talking to your crew about which changes you're going to make, how you're going to respond, and where you're going to do that, in what situations, is super, super helpful. And like I said, it just prevents those last minute surprises happening on the day that they're not prepared for, which runs the risk that they don't go together. And ultimately, the most important thing to make the boat go fast is that they do it as a unit. You can't make the boat go fast on your own. You have to do it with the rest of your crew. So planning for situations like that kind of gives you the best chance for that to happen. So if it is close and you haven't already done your big move, then you can bring that forward. I've been in crews before where we didn't have a set time where we were going to use our big move. It was that we didn't really have much experience racing any of the crews that we'd raced before. We didn't know where they were going to throw in a move, where they were going to be fast in the race. So we knew we had it in the bank, but we hadn't planned where it was going to be. That itself is quite a unique scenario. I don't always recommend it. It was a very experienced crew that I was doing that with, and that's why it could kind of work. But they trusted me to basically, within a K to the finish, decide where the finish sprint was. Okay. And in that situation, the field was going and we were only just hanging on. So at the K, we had to go. So we did. And we did literally make a finish sprint and make our move with a K to go. And we just got ourselves up there. And once you're up there, we were able to hold on because of the experience of the crew. So it's about trusting your instinct and reading the race and knowing your crew. So talking to them, what have you done in practice? You're not going to pull something special and kind of reinvent the wheel on race day. But if you know what your crew are capable of, trust your instinct of when you ask for that. Choose your moments. Another point is kind of keeping your eye regularly on the whole field. So if you're in a one-on-one situation, it's really easy to get caught up in that and think, oh, this is the only race that's going on. That's not true. There could be people really creeping up on you. So don't be tempted to get caught up in that. Do take a little look over your shoulder and make sure that you are also kind of accounting for someone that might be pushing behind you. There is 6 lanes, not just 2. Just remember that. The most important thing in this whole situation of being in the one-on-one scenario is that you sound in control of the situation. That doesn't mean you have to be quiet and calm all the time. By all means, use the varying kind of pitch and volume in your voice, but make sure that you're calmly letting them know where they are and how you're going to make sure that they are the crew that comes out on top. Now, when I say the crew that comes out on top, obviously we hope that that means that you're going to win the race or you're going to beat them. But realistically, not everyone in this call can come off on top in that way. But what you can do is that you can have a great success by going as fast as you can in that moment, by staying as internal as possible, by them trusting you and what you called, them buying in. And that's how I would measure success. Did we produce the best move that we were capable of? Yes, we didn't win, but ultimately we did produce what we were capable of on the day. And that's a win in my eyes. And that's about like that redefining success situation that we've talked about before as WOX. And you can talk about that quite a bit in your debrief, which we're going to go on to in a second. But I quickly want to address the sprint because we had a lot of questions about tiers. Okay, everyone loves to talk about tiers these days. I know that famously Brooks used that as how they call their sprint into the finish, and they have 3 steps, if you like, into the finish. And I just want to kind of debunk the tier situation, that they are not anything special or different to what anyone else does. Yes, Brooks might execute it incredibly well, and that's fine. But actually, what you call them is irrelevant. It's what you want to call them. You can call them gears, you can call them steps, you can call them anything you want, as long as it makes sense to your crew, like we've talked about. Prepare with your crew, talk to your crew, and decide what they want to hear. But ultimately, the most important thing is that you know what the outcome needs to be. Is it rate? Is it boat speed? Is it maintenance of speed? All are fine, but it needs to be within your plan. And if you have a look back at my plan, you'll see that there's a question mark there. What is your aim for that? And that will be individual to your crew. Okay, let's move on to post-race. Okay, so in the cool down, there's kind of 2 options for this, on water and off water. So you make sure you need to plan this in advance. Again, all of this, it requires pre-planning because you don't want people kind of floating off and doing their own thing. As Zoe said, it is like herding cats often with rowers. So on the water, if you're doing an on water cool down, you need to make sure you know the circulation rules. You need to know how far you're going to go and what you're going to include in that bit of paddling. And that needs to be decided with your coach and your crew. Athletes should have some sort of recovery ready to go on the land so that they can rehydrate and refuel. So often they'll go for squash and a banana, but that's up to them and their personal preference. But make sure they've got that in a handy place ready to get as soon as they get off the water so that they're preparing for their next race. That's really crucial on days where you're racing multiple times in the same day. It's crucial anyway, but especially crucial on those days. Now, if you're doing an off-water cool down, then your coach is likely to have a suggestion for kind of how far you want to do this. But a pretty classic one is walking to the 250 marker and back. But just really do keep in mind the distance between where the course is and where your boat is being kept and factor that in. And don't make sure that they're not walking for absolutely miles if they don't need to be. But equally, they do need to do enough that it properly does kind of flush some of that lactate out after the race to prepare them for what's coming next. Okay. Now, no matter what, you need to set a debrief time as soon as you get off the water. When you're sending them off for that cool down, I would suggest that you go with them. It's not always possible, but definitely set a time where you meet back at the boat so that you can have a proper debrief. I saw a question come in about kind of what the best way to do that is. So I'll cover that now. A debrief is a good idea after each race of the day, time trial, semi and final. A debrief is a really broad definition. So I would say after a time trial, if it's gone really well, all you need to say is that was a really good row and we executed what we wanted to execute and that's done. But if there was something you want to work on, like, okay, when we did the finish sprint, I felt like we weren't quite as cohesive in this moment. I think we need to do this for the semi-final later. Everyone agree? Yeah, good, done. It doesn't have to be a long debrief after every race, but you do need to figure out, is everyone on the same page about what just happened? And is there any action points for the next race? Okay. No matter what, it needs to be constructive, especially if you're racing again that day. How do you make it not personal? How do you make sure that you're being constructive with your feedback? And that is something that, again, will be a little bit personal with personal to different crews. Some crews can really take it and you can be really blunt. Some you need to kind of be careful with your words, but you should know that and you can figure that out as you go. If you ever want any specific kind of help on that, do let us know and we can kind of chat about some of our experiences. But I won't go in depth on that right now. You need to have clear defined action points, like I said, and feel free to ask questions. Try and bring a solution if you can, if something hasn't been quite right. But if you don't have an answer, then bring it to your coach and say, look, this is what I felt and I'm not 100% sure what we could have done differently, and see what they've got to say and then bring that to the debrief. Whilst they're off doing their cool down, it's a perfect time for you to have your own little individual debrief with your coach about what happened. You can speak a bit more frankly and you can figure out how you're going to present it to the crew during that time. Okay, that was a lot from me, a lot of words, but that's pretty much it. I think just make sure that in that you've also decided when you're meeting back for your next race. Make sure that everyone knows whether that's a hands-on time or whether that's the time that you're going to meet and have a chat about what you're going to do, your pre-race chat. Okay, I'm done. I think we're moving on to questions now. So there's a couple in the chat that we'll go through. And then once we've done those, feel free to kind of unmute yourself and give us a question if you've got anything that we haven't covered.
I think I've answered the questions in the chat.
Oh, you're awesome. Okay, great.
They're probably done. So if anyone else wants
to amazing. Well done.
Stick anything else in there now, then do so. And likewise, if anyone has a question that they want to ask via email or anything like that, that's absolutely fine. We'll get to it as soon as we can during the week. If we don't have any other questions, and anyone would like to stay to just go over doing sort of more in-depth stake boat stuff, then please do. We've got a couple questions just coming on now. I think motivational calls, it's not for us to tell you, like, they've got to be personal. We can't, the thing you have to do as a cox is you have to know your crew. That's the main thing. So you've got to know what motivates them. So a call that I find motivational, Morgan might not, for example. So I don't think, personally, I like to make motivational calls that are more technical. So, trying to make changes in a more technical fashion, but it's got to be what works for your crew, basically.
I also think sometimes with the motivational stuff, if you've ever done any hard exercise yourself, something that gets you through is real kind of like task orientated, achievable targets. And so saying, right, we're going to have 10 strokes and I want you to really think about being like springy in the first quarter, or this 10 strokes is going to be about loose catches. Like it seems like a technical things and not potentially that motivational, but actually the cox's job is to give the rower a job to do, and they proceed to do that job until you give them another job. And sometimes that can be incredibly useful and motivating within itself, if that makes any sense. And then simply saying like this is working, like we've got a change in speed as a result of doing that change, you are motivating them. It doesn't have to be this big, kind of like groundbreaking speech where you fight them on the trenches, whatever. Like it doesn't need to be like that. It can actually be very pragmatic.
Mm-hmm. Just to follow on from that, there's another question which I think leads on quite nicely, which is some rowers have fed back that I can be too plan focused and I need to kind of focus more on reading the boat. Is it better to plan everything out or know exactly what to do in that moment? So what I would say is if you look at that race plan table that I put up there, you only really have in that plan something for every 250. And actually, when you're on the water and you're doing 250, that's quite a long period. So that does allow, making a plan like that does actually allow for some freedom, and it allows you to read the race and feel the boat and respond to what's happening. The columns down the side, it's not really about over planning because you're not necessarily going to use every single thing in those tables during your race. It's about knowing what you can cherry pick out of that at the right moment to personalize it to what you're feeling in the boat in that moment. So there's no such thing as over planning with a format like that. Does that make sense? Hopefully that's helpful to Madison there. But yeah, that's how I would say it. Anything else?
Those are what those what ifs are for, basically, because
Exactly.
it's like, well, okay, now I'm down, now I'm up.
Yeah.
You've got those bits to choose from, so you don't have to decide it at the time. You've got it planned already.
Mm-hmm. Before we lose, is a race plan in a single also equally important? Yes, it is. It's a long way in a single, not having a race plan, 2K on your own. So yeah, definitely make sure that you've broken up the race and you've got some really useful points for each part of the race, because if there's no guarantee in a singles race that there's going to be people next to you all the time for you to work with, there could be massive gaps or whatever. So yeah, definitely have a plan, I would say, before we lose that one.
There's a good question here about how to make sure the race plan is clear during the race and key moments missed. And for me, I would say the answer to that question is silence. Yeah. So silence and change of tone. So if you're doing your whole race and everything sounds monotonous and screamy and high pitched and shouty, then people aren't going to hear when you call something big. If you go from, okay, guys, we're coming up to the 750. This is our big move. On this one, ready, go. Then you're built into it. You've given a bit more space, a bit more time. They're going to hear that. So I would say this is where listening to your race recordings and listening to your recordings in general is really important. If you listen back and all you're hearing is one tone, one noise, one volume, stuff's going to get lost. Sure. If you hear space and you hear changes of tone and variation at different important parts, you hear those clear goes, then that's going to be how you get heard. So that's why you need to listen back, I'd say.
Totally agree with that.
We've got a question here about how to keep rowers' heads in the boat. If you can work it out, please tell me, because in my Olympic final, I still had someone who was constantly looking out the boat. So other than reminding them, I don't know if anyone has any better suggestions.
Sometimes support from coaches can be helpful for that one as well, because you can't always tell they're doing it. Often it's quite obvious, but sometimes it's not. But ultimately, like having a heads in call can be really useful if you know that your crew are particularly bad for that. Then that's something that you can put in your technical fundamentals even, and you can just say one of the main calls we're going to have and a constant reminder we're going to have every 250 will be to have the heads in or something, and that can just be something you include in your race plan.
There's a good question here about getting feedback from rowers who are less talkative between the heats, time trials and finals. Oh, yeah. That's something that's really difficult to do on race day. That's something that you kind of need to build up in practice, I'd say. And I think we've talked quite a bit about getting feedback in some of our other webinars. So that's something that I think you need to set up in advance. You need to have a culture of getting feedback. And often you need to just ask people really direct questions. If you think someone isn't great at giving feedback, they might be uncomfortable about doing it. You ask them something specific. So I could say, Morgan, what did you think of my call to get us onto our rhythm in that race? So rather than just, have you got any feedback, really specific questions, so that then they can recall something specific and answer it rather than a general sort of, well, I'm not really sure. I don't know if anyone else has any.
Yeah, and I think you can gain a lot from their answer anyway. So say Zoe asked that question and I went, there was a call to get on rhythm. Then you'd be like, okay, well, I obviously either wasn't very clear, or for whatever reason it didn't get communicated across well enough. And you might well have said it and they might simply have not been listening. So then you have to think about, right, well, how do I manage my voice so that there is not a single chance the next time around they cannot miss this call? You know, it's something like that. Or as well, you're going to have individuals who might not want to give feedback in front of everybody. And so, like, take the time, go for a walk with them. Oh, are you walking to the 250? I'll come with you. Like, yeah, I'll just walk along with you. And then you create kind of like an approachable environment where you can guide it out of them. So just like in any working environment, you have different characters. You're going to have that in rowing, in your crew boat. So it's thinking about the ways where, if you know your athletes, it's probably easier to figure out the best way to communicate with them and the right sort of environment to get feedback from them.
Wow, the questions are rolling in. This is great. Well done, everyone. So it says, is it important to make split/distance stroke per stroke calls during the race? That is, again, really individual to your crew. It depends what your goals are for the race and kind of if your crew like to hear that. If your crew really like to hear the split and that's how they judge their speed, then absolutely yes. In terms of rate, normally only really just to give them feedback on where it's at. You don't need to constantly give them that, especially in the middle of the race, unless it's really slipping down or creeping up. Just to give them that feedback, to be specific on how you're going to get back on your rhythm. But ultimately, just a couple of hints here and there of, you know, when you're off the start, okay, we're up at 39 or whatever. Okay, we've stepped out onto rhythm. We're aiming for 35 today. Ready, go. And then say if they've hit it. But ultimately, just every 100 meters telling them what the rate is isn't really that useful, I don't think. But again, it's very individual to the crew, and splits are probably more useful, especially if you're not working off of other crews. But in a 6-lane race, it can be about what your boat is doing, and you do need to be internal sometimes, but often you can't because you're also working with the people around you. So it's finding that balance between, okay, we're on a good speed here, so I'm not going to panic about the situation going on around me, or actually there's a situation going on around me and the split is telling me that that's for a reason and we need to do something about it. So it's how you use it is really crucial, but just shouting at them what the splits and rates are is less useful.
Okay, I'm aware that we're running pretty late on time, so we're just gonna have to take any other questions that don't get answered. I think just email us and we will try and get back to you in the next day to answer them. One thing I would say is there's just a question about what would we recommend in order to learn more about coxing. That's obviously why we're here. So you can follow us at The Winning Cox, particularly on Instagram, and the same, that's our YouTube channel as well. So there's some bits and pieces on there already. And if there's specific things you want to know, then get in touch with us. Also, thewinningcox@gmail.com. You can email us directly. And we will try our best to cover anything that you would like to do. So if you would like to stay and go over a little bit more in-depth stuff about getting onto the stake boat, then please do. Otherwise, it has been great to have everyone. If you have enjoyed it and you'd like to keep supporting us and make sure that we can offer these sessions more often, then please do consider buying us a coffee. You can do that on the link that we've just sent through, or you can stick your phone and point it at that QR code that's on the screen now. So we'd really appreciate that. Otherwise, thank you for coming, and yeah, do stay if you want to go over getting onto the stake boat in more depth. But otherwise, it was lovely to see you, and good luck with your racing.
Okay, I actually don't have a video for this, but I guess my question for you guys is what your questions are specifically around the stake boats and what we'd approach and what races they are in particular, because I also think that makes a bit of a difference. So you can pop those into the chat and we can talk about it, or I can give you some examples of how I think it changes. Scenarios such as Dawny are fairly clear in that you row across and you get attached, you come on from a warm-up lake, and it all seems quite clean and fairly transparent. I think sometimes in situations like the Masters Championships that can happen over 1,000 meters, and they're often at Nottingham, you often go past the state boats because the state boats are going to be at halfway, and then you're rowing onto them from your lane. That is in some regards a little bit easier because you're kind of going around them as they're going to be in the center of your lane, and then you're getting attached, which is a lot more like Henley Royal. But in those scenarios, again, I think the key parts is thinking about the wind. So the video that we have of, Tintin on the starter line is a prime example of how the wind, she's scratching the boat on against the wind, and very quickly from the moment she stops, it swings back around straight. So just trying to think about dealing with the wind can be quite a big kind of game changer for that. When you're thinking about how you're going to back down, whether you're in a single, whether you're coxing yourself, think about which way the wind's blowing, position yourself kind of against the wind so that you can use the wind to assist you into that position. So instead of thinking about it as this thing that makes it more challenging and almost a bit scary, think about it as something that's there to help you. The wind can help you into position. So that might be that if the wind is pushing against my stroke side blades, I'm going to position myself a little bit into the wind, into the stroke side position, so that as I'm backing it down, it's blowing me into the center. Whereas if I position myself a bit too much to the bow side, it's probably going to blow me out the lane. Another thing you can do is kind of, sometimes you might have a bit of an older stake boat person, so kind of talk to them about it, like the wind's going to push me, I'm probably going to come at you quite quickly. If it's a cross headwind, it's going to push you against the stake boats quite quickly. So that's less backing it down, but just take your time. I think that's probably a key part is if you're patient and take your time, you'll actually get attached quickly. If you panic and rush, you're going to make more mistakes and it's going to take a lot longer. Back into the stake boats, not too fast. I would say try and use pairs when you're trying to back into the stake boat. So to get the boat going with a bit of momentum from stationary, you might use a 4 in the 8. If you're in a 4, you're only going to use a pair, but get down to a pair fairly early so you can manipulate the speed at which the hull is moving. Then I would make sure that I'm easy there fairly early once the boat's got some momentum. So once the boat has got momentum and it's moving towards the stake boat, stop them from backing down, so you let it run. And then what you're going to do is I would say to the crew and prepare the crew, say, when I say, I want you to hold it up. And so just before you're about to, like, they're going to grab your stern, the stake boat holder, I'd say, hold it up. And you essentially put the brakes on, and then it means that it's easy for them to hold. What you don't want to do is keep backing it down, backing it down, backing it down, still backing, they're trying to catch you, and you're still backing, and then you've gone flying into the stake boat. We want it to be that we build up a bit of speed, then we let it glide, and then we stop the boat so that they can just grab hold of it. Remember, this is also a person's hand. So we don't want them getting stuck underneath between the hull and the stake boat themselves. They're probably going to move their hands out of the way. If you're coming in too fast, and I was a stake boat holder, I'd put my hands out of the way and I would just let you crash because you need to slow down. So take your time. Yes, stern pair backing makes a big difference. I think that's what I would do, because then you can use the bow pair to keep you straight or be a little bit aware of what's going on. They might straighten you up as you're going along. So one of them might back it down because you're traveling in reverse. And if you're taking your time, this seems so silly, but I don't know, like when you go to learn to drive, if you try and park quickly, you're going to do it wrong. So you take your time. So I think just be really patient and also, if you want to practice it, like practice it with your coaches, practice it in training.
That's exactly what I
Any
was
other-
going to say. I think, you know, there's no reason why, like everything else that we do, this shouldn't be something that you try and practice, especially if you're concerned about it. And if you're on the day and it's nervous and that's the first time you've ever done it, that's going to be even harder. So if you're concerned, say to your coach, can we just give it a go? You know, either have them sort of lie on the end of the landing stage or, you know, off the side of the launch, whatever's suitable. And then you can just give it a go and your crew will have experience doing it as well and will have had a chance to practice it. And even if you don't have that for whatever reason, you don't have someone who coaches you regularly, you can still practice the movement. So you can line yourself up towards something. Okay, you're not going to go onto it because there's no one there to catch you, but you can practice getting different people to back it down. You can see what kind of speed it is with 4 or pairs. Like Morgan said, you can get them practicing holding it up quickly from backing down. So you can practice the maneuvering, even if you don't actually have the setup to kind of be getting onto a stake boat. So is that helpful for everyone? Hopefully, yes.
Yeah, are there any more questions?
Yeah, there's no silly questions, is what I would say.
Oh,
We've all
absolutely.
Agreed.
we you know, I've told this story, I think, certainly to the WOX mentors, but we've all ended up in situations where it's been challenging. And, you know, I've certainly started at Dorney Lake and been at the wrong direction and they've said go. And I've spent the first 200 meters going down someone else's lane. You know, it happens. And I think if you're calm, you can deal with the situation. If you panic and get caught in the red mist, then it's going to be harder to respond to. So again, the reason we practice things is we don't ever want you to be fearful of making mistakes. They're going to give you opportunities to progress. What we don't want is for you to make dangerous mistakes. And that's what we're trying to kind of work on, really.
We just had one last question just about using pressure, cruise pressure rather than rudder. No, you'd always use the rudder first. Using pressure, asking people to put on more pressure or less pressure, especially during a race, is only going to be disruptive. So I would only use that in an emergency. And if you need it because the rudder is not enough, or if something happens to the rudder, you know, or if it's like something, the only time you do that as planned is a race like Head of the Charles, where there's a massive bend. So you'd have to have that planned in advance. But I definitely wouldn't do that as a standard. So great. Okay, guys. Well, let's wrap it up there because we have run on. But thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate having everybody here, and we hope this has been useful, whether you were able to come in person or whether you're watching this back. And yeah, please, like I said, have a look at all our various channels at The Winning Cox. And we hope to see you at our next webinar. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Thank
much,
you.
everybody.
Bye, everyone.